In this video, I will be performing and discussing an anonymous unmeasured prelude found in the Parville manuscript. I've talked about the Parville manuscript in previous videos, but very briefly, this manuscript was created around 1670 and is one of the two major sources for the music of Louis Couperin, the other source being the Voix manuscript. It is now housed in the Music Library of the University of California, Berkeley. One of the reasons I chose to perform this particular prelude was that it was completely unknown to me, and I enjoyed the challenge of approaching it without having any preconceived ideas about it or being influenced by any other performances. What I would like to do is demonstrate how I go about identifying the different gestures in the music and also offer suggestions on how to shape them. However, it is very important to stress that, especially when it comes to the repertory of unmeasured preludes, there are limitless ways of navigating through them. So the purpose of this video is not to propose a fixed interpretation, but rather to offer strategies on how to approach an unmeasured prelude, especially if you're coming to this repertory for the first time, and find meaningful musical patterns in what, upon initial observation, may seem like an endless series of undifferentiated whole notes. The video will be structured as follows. First, you're going to listen to my performance of the piece accompanied by the score. Then, while looking at specific portions of the score, I will demonstrate how to identify musical gestures and how to shape them. Finally, you will listen to my performance of the piece once more. Let's begin with the performance.
The first thing to address is the form of the piece. I think it was fairly easy to see that we can basically subdivide it in three sections, with the two outer sections being unmeasured, while the middle section is measured. In case you're not familiar with the unmeasured preludes of Louis Couperin, this type of three-part form with a measured middle section also occurs in a few of his preludes. Interestingly enough, there is, or at least there survives, only one prelude in D minor by Louis Couperin, and it follows precisely this three-part form. Before we start looking at the score, I'd like to make a general remark about studying unmeasured preludes, and that is to not study them or practice them too much. What I personally try to do is get to a level where I feel comfortable enough with the notes that I have the freedom to shape the gestures in the way I want to without having to worry about the technical aspects of performance. It goes without saying that if there are technically tricky passages, I do want to solve the technical issues so that they don't hinder my imagination. But at the same time, I don't want to practice the piece to such an extent that I end up having a fixed interpretation of it in my head. I want to leave enough unknowns so I can respond in a different way every time I play it. And now, let's turn to the score. Now, the first gesture that we see is a descending D minor scale. In other words, this. And what I would say is important here is to shape it in some sort of way. So don't simply play a descending scale, but decide what kind of shape it's going to have. For example, what I like to do is linger on the first note, then go faster as I go down, but then perhaps kind of apply the brakes right before the final note. So something like this. But again, there's more than one way of doing it. Now, the next thing that we see, you notice there that we have three repeating Ds. And of course, the first one was part of the descent that we just played. Then we have two more. Now, what is interesting about this, in other words, the idea of having two repeated notes followed by a step above. When we have something like this, now we get into a different type of possibility that you can find in a score like this, and that is that you may find written out ornaments. And here we have one possibility of a written out ornament, and more specifically, something that is called a port de voix. Let me show you what this looks like from the table of ornaments of Jean-Henri d'Anglebert. So you can see here that we have two types of port de voix. We have an ascending one and a descending one. On the top staff, we have the actual sign that is used for that ornament, but then the bottom staff, the realization, we indeed have
we have this type of thing. In other words, exactly what we see in the unmeasured prelude. So I want to alert you that you're going to find this type of perhaps written out ornament throughout this prelude, sometimes ascending and sometimes descending. So we can have either form. Now, does this mean that every time we see two repeated notes followed by a step upwards or a step downwards, does it have to be interpreted as a port de voix? That, I think, is really going to depend on the context of the music and how you think it should be interpreted. But you should be aware that sometimes in these unwritten preludes, what you may see could very well be a written out ornament. And in this case, if you want to interpret this particular one as a written out ornament, you could do something like this, and then separate it from the two notes that follow. So up to now, we have something like this. And here, I would say, to me, this is a chord, so I kind of play it like one. And then I think of this as one gesture. And then the right hand. And what I try to do there is, you notice that there are all of these slurs and wavy lines, and a lot of them usually tell us how long we are supposed to be holding certain notes. So if I were to start from the trill on the C sharp in the left hand, I'm holding this, and I'm holding the F and the A, so we have basically a tonic chord that is sounding there. And to me, that's kind of the end of a certain phrase. We've had all of these individual gestures, but we've also had a phrase that kind of has gone from the tonic to the dominant, back to the tonic. And the next thing we're going to have is another descending scale in D minor. And I'm going to try to give it a similar shape to what I did the first time. So once I decide on a shape, then when I see these kinds of scalar passages, I try to play them pretty much the same way, because I'm trying to have groups of different gestures, so that this also alerts the listener that we have something similar happening again. Now, this particular one has a little extension, so after I slightly hesitate going down to the D, then and that's where we change harmonies again. So at that point in time, I would actually make a little break with what is going to happen next. Now, again, what you see in the right hand can be interpreted in different ways. The way I would play it there is something like this. So again, I'm trying to give it a little shape. I'm trying to make it into some sort of a melody. And what follows next, of course, is a potential port de voix. So you can see how I'm shaping all of these little gestures. Obviously, there is more than one way of doing it, but I would say the point is to actually do it. Now, let me change what I'm showing you. Up to now, we've seen lines 1 and 2. Now I want to show you the second line again, but together with the third line, because now we're getting into something different here, and this is the fact that when you reach the end of a line, you have to keep in mind that this is not necessarily the end of a measure. In other words, what we see at the end of the second line is not some sort of an ending or a pause or any sort of cadence, but could continue on to the third line. And of course, I unfortunately do not have the original manuscript to compare, so I don't know exactly how it appears in the manuscript. But I would say if we look at this and we kind of interpret it as a break, it doesn't make musical sense to me. In other words, if we do this, somehow, if I just look at the right hand, I think the melody kind of continues between the two lines. So what I'm going to try to do here, especially because sometimes when a piece is especially not published, the right and left hands may not be perfectly aligned in the original manuscript. Again, I don't have the original, so I cannot compare, but to me, it doesn't make much sense to do this, then stop, then do the left hand. I want to somehow integrate them. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to play it in slow motion so you can see what I'm doing, or rather you can hear what I'm doing, is that I'm going to try to incorporate the high D in the left hand at the very beginning of the third line. I'm going to try to incorporate it in the melody line that we have in the second line. So that the whole thing could sound something like this. And to me this sounds better integrated. Continuing on, that's kind of like a little written out ornament. And here I'm really thinking of a chord with a little non-chord tone in the middle of it. Now, at that point in time, and now I want to show you lines 3 and 4, what is going to happen next is that we are going to have a little dialogue between the upper voice and the middle voice, or at least that's how I see it. So if we look just at the right hand, at the end of the third line and the beginning of the fourth line, we have something like this. And what this means is that at that point in time, I want to make those gestures very recognizable, but I also want to give them a certain rhythmic regularity. It's almost as if at that point, I want the piece to be more measured than unmeasured. So now the one very beautiful moment there, if we start a little earlier than what I did, if we go here, we have this C sharp and then, now it doesn't say anywhere to hold the C sharp, but I would actually hold it a little bit more because I think it's such a beautiful moment there. Then here the pattern is going to change. And so on. Now let's look at the next line. This is the fifth line of the score. And here I want to talk about another possibility of measuring things. So if I start from where you see the B flat octave in the left hand, I try to keep this the left hand having some sort of a beat, shall we say, and then I shape the right hand gestures accordingly. So now, the next thing that's going to happen, and you can't really see it completely because we have a page change, is that we have two descending scales, and you see the first four notes in the fifth line here, and now you see the rest of it. I try to keep those two again similar because I'm giving this descending scalar passage a particular shape. The next thing I want to talk about is how to approach getting into the measured section of the prelude. And what I try to do here is try to do it a little gradually. So let me start a little before what we see as a measured section. And then what I'm going to do is, instead of actually going directly into 4/4 and having regular quarter notes, I'm going to linger on the very first chord on this one. And then I'm going to actually get to a steadier tempo. So So I want to kind of blend the two sections a little bit together. I don't want it to be too sudden, otherwise I think it sounds a little sudden. Again, I want to kind of make it a little more gradual. And I will do the exact same thing when we get to the end of the measured section and we go to the unmeasured section. Let's look at that for a moment. Now, what is happening here, if we look at the first two lines, first of all, these are the last two measured lines of the piece, is that we have a certain idea that again has to do with a scalar passage, this time an ascending one. So now, if we get to that one, where you have the D and the F sharp, then notice that we go to an F natural, which again is this very nice flavorful moment, kind of like what we saw in the third line between the C sharp that was followed by the C natural. So to me, this is kind of a surprise because up to that point, the harmony has been a little more consistent. And then you get the surprise. So I actually use this surprise as a way of slowly getting out of the rhythmic pattern that I've had up to that point. Let me start a little before. then at that point we go back to the unmeasured section. So with a nice chord. But again, the idea is I try to find a way to blend the two together rather than make them very distinct from each other. Obviously, again, this is my decision, this is my interpretation. You may feel like doing the opposite, but I'm simply showing you how I'm going about blending the two sections together. The last thing I would like to mention has to do with the very end of the prelude, and let's look at the last line where we have something like this. The first thing to notice, and this is kind of amusing, is that if you look very carefully, you will notice that we have a C sharp that's actually a half note. So this is a very peculiar moment in this completely unmeasured area of the prelude, because we actually have a different note value. Again, I don't know how this relates to the original manuscript, but to me, it's simply actually a means of showing that you should be holding that a little longer. And of course, the slur emphasizes that as well. Now, the other thing that I would say here has to do with how to play all those final chords. And what I try to do is not play them all the same. So, and again, notice that here I try to play this all together. I don't leave as much space, let's say, between the C sharp and the G as the notation suggests, because I find that this is part of one chord. And then I'm going to dwell on the next chord because it's such a beautiful dissonance. Since we're really leading to this one, then the next one I'll play a little faster. So I'm leaning on this, then I'm going to wait a little longer on this one because it is our tonic. The next one, it's kind of a passing chord, kind of a dominant-ish chord. And then and if you remember this three-note repetition at the end of a piece is pretty much identical to what happens at the end of Froberger's Lament in F minor, which I had posted a little while ago, although there, of course, the final chord is an F major chord, so what happens there is this. And I kind of play this the same way. In other words, yes, we have three notes. I play the first two a little closer to each other and hesitate or wait to play the final one. It could even be more than that. As a short epilogue, I would like to offer one more suggestion regarding the study of unmeasured preludes, and I will explain in a moment why I did not include it with my previous suggestions. I think it is extremely important, especially when we're dealing with unpublished unmeasured preludes, to consult the original source if possible. The reason for this is that when it comes to handwritten manuscripts, there are crucial details that can be very unclear or can be interpreted in several ways. For instance, when it comes to all the slurs and the wavy lines you see, it can be hard to determine exactly where they begin and where they end. Perhaps even more crucially, the alignment of the notes between the left and right hand can often be extremely unclear. This means that in any modern edition, the editor has to decide how to solve all of these issues in order to present a readable edition. In other words, the editor has to make very important decisions, especially when it comes to how the notes should be properly aligned. And while an experienced editor is going to bring their invaluable expertise in the choices that they make, I think it is still important for a performer to be aware of what the original is like and what other possible solutions are available. What I have ended up doing in several cases is to make my own performing edition based on the original source, while also taking into consideration the solutions offered in modern editions. With this prelude, however, I run into a problem. As far as I know, the Parville manuscript is not available for viewing online. However, there is a wonderful edition by Colin Tilney entitled The Art of the Unmeasured Prelude, which supposedly presents all the unmeasured preludes that have survived. One volume contains facsimiles of the original manuscripts or editions, while the second volume presents a modern edition of all the preludes. Curiously though, this particular prelude does not seem to be included in this edition, or at least I couldn't find it. This presented me with a problem because ideally what I would have liked to do is not just consult the facsimile of the original manuscript for my own study of the prelude, but I also plan to juxtapose it with a modern edition in this video and show you the potential differences between the two. So this part of my initial plan will have to wait until I present another unmeasured prelude in the future. And this also explains why I decided to present this commentary as an epilogue to my presentation. As always, thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoy the performance.